For all the political polarisation in the States, there is something that both parties and successive governments have tended to agree on. World-leading navies generally benefit from having ships, and the United States Navy could probably do with more of them. To that end, successive governments and naval leaders have released 30-year shipbuilding plans, containing new ideas and concepts of how to get the US surface fleet back on track. That said, for the last couple of decades, the US has been much more consistent producing those plans than it has the ships themselves. The LCS program was cancelled at a fraction of the intended program size. The Zumwalt destroyers were cancelled after 3 ships, the Constellation-class frigates after 2, and more recently, America's next-generation destroyer, the DDGX, may have actually exceeded even the Constellation's performance by apparently managing to get itself sidelined before steel was cut on a single vessel. In place of the next-generation destroyer, the plan was now apparently the return of the battleship. And it's these that have made it into the most recent US shipbuilding plan, albeit with a twist. Because what was criticised by some as a gold-plated, overly expensive, industrially challenging design has now apparently had the gold plating stripped off and replaced with platinum. Because USS Defiant apparently isn't just meant to be the first battleship built anywhere in something like 3/4 of a century, it's meant to be the world's first ever nuclear-powered battleship with a price tag to match. And so today we're going to crack open the recently released US Navy 30-year shipbuilding plan for fiscal year 2027, trying to get some insights into this new US naval buildup, the vision for the future fleet, and the ongoing contest between things like the battleship and the budget. We'll start with a brief discussion of what this document actually is, and critically, what it isn't. Then we'll look at what kind of navy it envisions the United States building over the next 3 decades, splitting them into the big, the mostly unchanged compared to previous plans, the small, and the missing. That means looking at various ship classes, from converted Coast Guard cutters turned frigates to nuclear-powered battle wagons, and asking how many the plan intends to build and how much it expects them to cost, before finally zooming out and asking, in practical terms, what does this thing actually mean for the future of US naval power? But first, let me welcome back long-term sponsors of the channel, Private Internet Access. One of the oddities of the way the modern digital environment has evolved is that while sending data across physical borders almost anywhere in the world has never been quicker or easier, sometimes those physical borders have found a way to push back. In some places, fragmentation of the internet is just a reality. And so if you want to navigate the modern digital environment while also trying to protect your privacy at the same time, you might want layers of tools and practices at your disposal. Just like a piece of military equipment might have a survivability onion made up of various active and passive layers, you as an individual might want to employ things like strong passwords, careful browsing, close control and custody of your physical devices, and also, if you're like me, potentially a VPN. That can allow you, with a click, to reroute your internet traffic and change your publicly perceived IP address, with PIA giving you access to servers in 90 countries around the world, as well as all 50 US states. Private Internet Access has an open source codebase, is available cross-platform, and also advertises compatibility with a range of streaming services. And, as I previously noted, unlike several of those streaming services, with PIA, a single subscription allows you to cover an unlimited number of devices. Kinda handy if, like me, you have plenty of them on the go. So if you're interested, there will be a link in the description which gives you access to an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 bonus months, covering an unlimited number of devices and advertised with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And so, with my thanks to PIA as always, let's get back to it. Okay, so let's quickly talk basics, the US military shipbuilding sector and where this plan fits into it. As we previously discussed, US shipbuilding has a bit of a storied history. In the 2020s though, the days of victory ship spam are long gone. The US now accounts for a fraction of a percent of global civilian shipbuilding, leaving military shipbuilding, such as it is, as a key bedrock for what US yards continue to do. The task of making bulk carriers or LNG tankers may have long passed the likes of Japan, South Korea and China, but if you want the likes of a nuclear submarine or an aircraft carrier, a majority of the capacity is still in the States. And that makes the long-term shipbuilding plans of the US Navy and Coast Guard pretty much the beginning and end of the story for large parts of the sector. And that's where the 30-year shipbuilding plan we want to discuss today comes in. Now let's be clear up front that the plan isn't a statement of what is actually going to happen. Not just because things change, but because critically, it's not an approved budget. In the United States, it's the US Congress that ultimately controls the purse strings, and they that get the final say about what ships are funded and potentially get built. Congress, year to year, ultimately has a huge amount of say over what the US Navy ends up looking like. They've currently legislated, for example, a minimum number of carriers that the force needs to operate, and they pretty consistently voted up more funds for shipbuilding than had been requested by the White House and the Navy. One of the best ways to think of the shipbuilding plan then might be as a kind of vision or statement of intent for what kind of Navy the Department of the Navy, so by extension the White House, wants to see built. It's a statement to the force, but also to Congress, that this is basically the force we're trying to build. This is what we think we need in order to do it. This is how much we think it's likely to cost. So please go ahead and start coughing up the money on schedule. As well as qualitative comments about particular ship categories or the nature of the Navy, one of the things we're really interested in here are two sets of data. You have detailed shipbuilding and funding requests covering the next 5 years out to fiscal year 2031, so the future year's defence program. That's how many ships they want to procure in a given year and how much they're likely to cost. Then you have tables of force planning information heading out 30 years, all the way out to fiscal year 2056. So how many ships are expected to be commissioned in a given year, how many are meant to be retired, and what will the fleet look like along the way. This plan doesn't tell us what kind of Navy the United States will actually build, but it does tell us a lot about the Navy the current White House wants to build. So, before we jump into the detail, big picture level, what does the plan say? Like many of these recent shipbuilding plans, including the changeover in administration, this presents itself as a rebuilding plan for the United States Navy. Basic implications include the P-7N Navy being too small for current demands, US shipbuilding industry and the US Navy's record on ship procurement being a bit of a shambles, and there being a genuine need to grow the current battle force and expand the US shipbuilding sector significantly in the coming decades. To give you a sense for tone, the plan begins with the following, quote, "We are at a strategic inflection point. For decades, while America's attention went elsewhere, our adversaries built fleets at a pace not seen in generations. During this time, our own maritime industrial base was weakened by inconsistent demand and misaligned priorities. This left our fleet smaller, our shipyards reduced in numbers and atrophied in capability, and our people facing unacceptable risk. We will not allow these conditions to continue." End quote. Before you even get to the ships, it then sets out 3 pillars. That the Navy needs to shift from, quote, "a slow compliance-based bureaucracy to an accountable warfighting enterprise," end quote. Talks about the need to build a larger, more lethal or more balanced fleet, delivering a high-low mix of advanced combatants, cost-effective frigates and unmanned systems, and also seeking to, quote, "ignite a renaissance in American shipbuilding," end quote. To do that, the plan calls for a significant increase in funding when you compare this to the fiscal year 2025 plan. Even if you're talking just about the next 5 years, you're looking at the shipbuilding investment budget for Battle Force ships jumping from sub $40 billion in fiscal 25 to being north of $60 billion US in fiscal 27, 28, 30 and 31. 29 is a bit of a dip, but even then it's still close to $50 billion. Over the full 30 years of the plan, you're talking about a 12-digit difference. Expressed another way, over 30 years, you might be looking at US military shipbuilding funding being topped up by more than the total value of all military aid to Ukraine by all parties since 2022. In terms of what that kind of funding is meant to buy you over time, what you're seeing here are charts using data taken from the plan, laying out some of the main components of the U.S.N. battle force by ship type between 2027 and 2056. As you can see, the goal here is to go from a sub-300 ship Navy at present to one pushing closer to 400 in the mid-2050s. Most of that growth, though, is relatively slow to kick off, and it's also unevenly distributed between ship classes. The carrier force, for example, is meant to remain mostly static over the 30 years, and the combined cruiser and destroyer force is actually smaller in some of these forward estimates than it is currently. The growth in surface combatant numbers, then, mostly comes from 2 types of ships. The guided missile battleships that start to appear in the force in the 2030s, and more importantly, in raw numerical terms at least, an absolute spam of the new FFX frigates. For the nuclear submarine force, the good news is that growth is likely to be significant, with the force going from just over 60 to more than 80 nuclear submarines of all types over the course of the plan, with the bad news being that it takes a considerable amount of time to get there. The force dips slightly in the early 2030s, starts to recover in the late 2030s, and then seriously picks up from there. What these figures don't entirely capture is the changeover in type that's meant to happen behind those numbers, with the ballistic missile force entirely replacing the old Ohio with the new Columbias over the course of this plan. While one area that does see a rapid uptick is in combat logistics and support vessels. This category, which includes a lot of critical ships like oilers, is meant to jump significantly between 2027 and 2037, with a lot of the growth being basically front-loaded and then stabilising in the 2040s. So basically, across the board, not many things go backwards. Some elements, like support ships and nuclear attack submarines, are scaled up, and 2 new ship classes are introduced at scale, the battleship and the frigate. Now, it's hopefully obvious looking at charts like this one that the idea of this plan is to boost the size of the US Navy. The natural next question to ask then, I think, is how much does it actually intend to do that, not just compared to the current baseline, but previous shipbuilding plans. So, first audience question of the episode, how many additional ships do you think all of that additional funding buys for the US Navy battle force over the course of the plan compared to the fiscal 25 version? Okay, I'm assuming your guesses are in, And if you picked any number that didn't start with a negative sign, you'd be wrong for most of the years covered by the plan. In ship count, but not necessarily tonnage, this plan would have the US Navy operating fewer Battle Force ships through most of the 2030s and all of the 2040s compared to the one from 2 years ago, before eventually both the old and new plan converge on a Battle Force of about 400 ships in 2056. That's a significant increase in both cases from a force of 291 today, but it probably immediately raises the question, how do you plan to spend a shit ton more money and end up with fewer boats? The complex answer here is there are a lot of moving parts and factors pulling in multiple directions. The simpler, but still largely correct answer is that the plan needs to build fewer ships because it plans to build some considerably more expensive ones, with the simplest answer being, in the brawl between the battleship and the budget, in this document, the battleships are winning. Compared to the FY 2025 plan, the new one purchases fewer frigates, slightly more destroyers, and differences in terms of things like carriers and subs are mostly around the edges. The difference is that lone orange bar sitting by itself, the battleships. So, let's have a look at the ship and class that are apparently meant to be able to sink anything out there, including the budget, the USS Defiant, and the ships to follow. We first talked about the US plan to bring back the battleship, or if you prefer, the heavy missile cruiser or the guided missile battle cruiser, soon after USS Defiant and the so-called Trump class were first announced. This was a ship that was meant to put the large back in large surface combatant, a 35,000-ton plus displacement ship, mounting, among other things, a pair of forward-mounted conventional guns, a railgun, a standard VLS array, a hypersonic VLS array, as well as an assortment of directed energy weapons, which in most cases don't really exist yet. The apparent idea was to create something at the highest of the high end of the high-low spectrum. Something that didn't really have to make any design compromises on things like armament, sensors, or aviation facilities because it was big enough to just fit all of them. As we noted at the time, though, the prospect of bringing back something with the size, if not the displacement, of the old Iowa-class battleships didn't come without its potential drawbacks. It was likely to be hideously expensive. There was a question over what US yards could actually build the things and on what timeline. The data release suggested they would be crew-intensive. Some of the weapon systems they relied on were still thoroughly experimental at best, and there was even, just from a math perspective, a question of whether or not the ship could efficiently do its primary job. As the current acting secretary of the Navy put it in their shipbuilding plan, the idea is for the battleship to, quote, bring resilient command and control, deep magazines, diverse weapons, and long reach in one platform. Fires, he goes on to say, is the king of battle, and wars are won by forces that bring both capacity and killing power to the fight. This ship delivers exactly that, end quote. But, as we previously discussed, if you leave aside the experimental railgun for the moment and focus just on the missiles, the proposed guided missile battleship is kind of shit at carrying guided missiles. As you can see on this chart we showed last time, in terms of the number of standard missile vertical launch cells carried, the proposed Defiant is significantly outgunned either by a pair of Zumwalts or a trio of either the US Arleigh Burke or the Chinese Type 55 missile cruiser. That matters because with a pair of Zumwalts or a trio of either other ship, you're looking at comparators that are either in the similar range or lower when it comes to both displacement or price when compared to Defiant. With either the very old now US Burke or the newer Chinese Type 55, you'd be looking at the Defiant being outshot on a missile-for-missile basis by something like 2 to 3 to 1, with tonnage and cost to spare. My point is there is a massive difference between a ship with a lot of firepower and a force with a lot of firepower. And on a cost-for-cost or ton-for-ton basis, based on the numbers we've been given, the battleship is just a pretty terrible way to add additional missile firepower to a fleet, compared to existing cruiser, destroyer, and even some frigate designs. Now sure, those ships don't have the larger VLS used for the Defiant's hypersonics, but the Zumwalts do, and those ships, which on paper here pack additional firepower, were, remember, considered overly expensive failures. But mere mathematical details like those aside, this plan doubles and triples down on the BBG, so guided missile battleship concept. The basic idea here seems to be that the battleship should provide the fleet with a higher end capability than a destroyer. It should provide, quote, longer endurance, higher speed, and accommodate advanced weapon systems required for modern warfare, end quote. The role of the battleship is thankfully not just to deliver high-volume, long-range defensive fires, which is a good thing given its lack of missile cells, and so some of the pitch here, if you like, focuses on the other traits that make the battleship different. In terms of those advantages, the document offers 6 hard arguments, if you like, and 2 soft ones. On the hard side, the battleship is meant to have room for advanced payload modules, including for future vertical launch systems with more capacity than the current Mark 41. Basically, eventually, you might be able to fit bigger and more advanced missile systems onto it. It's also, point 2, meant to be a launch platform for theatre nuclear weapons, which I take to be a suggestion that the US Navy's new nuclear cruise missile is meant to be mounted on this thing. Helpful, perhaps, from a survivability perspective, but it's also worth noting that in both cases, there's no reason the battleship has to be the launch platform. You could put a nuclear cruise missile launcher on just about anything that floats. Other countries already do. And if you go back to the Cold War, the US has tested firing missiles off some very small platforms in the past. The hypersonics also don't require something as big as a battleship to mount. The Zumwalts are already being fitted with them. The intention is to put them on submarines. And given their very, very long range, there's also always the option of just, putting them on the back of a truck. Because as the likes of Ukraine and Iran have helpfully demonstrated, while a modern warship might be pretty survivable, you can also do a lot with dirt, decoys, and a cave or two. It's also meant to provide much more power generation capacity, more on that later, advanced naval gunfire support, so think the forward-mounted railgun, which the plan seems to envision potentially having an air defence role, not just ground strike, and then also the internal volume necessary to embark a fleet command staff. The final hard argument is this ship is meant to be so capable so as to allow, quote, the battleship to single-handedly perform key missions to the sustainment of commerce, like holding open choke points on critical sea lines of communication that would otherwise require a wider commitment of assets from the fleet, end quote. Basically, this thing is well-armed and well-defended enough that you could send it into the Strait of Hormuz alone, whereas normally you might be nervous about doing that. A counterpoint might be that it's reasonable to expect that a 35,000-ton ship would be able to do the job of multiple other ships because it's a 35,000-ton ship. And for the same investment, you could probably field multiple existing destroyers and maybe a support ship or two. It's also hard to imagine one or a handful of ships escorting a meaningful number of vessels through a maritime choke point, while if you focus on the more coercive and strike-oriented side of the war in the Middle East, the carriers delivered a lot more firepower than a battleship would have been able to, while not needing to push into the strait, and on a cost-for-cost basis, other platforms would have had the battleship beat in terms of missile slinging capacity. To cap it all off, the document puts forward what it describes as two unique advantages of the battleship. Firstly, that it represents a, quote, commitment to the future, end quote. The basic argument here is the battleship will be large enough and have enough power generation on board that if in the future new technologies, new systems, new modules, new components are developed, there'll be plenty of room to integrate those onto the battleship and plenty of juice to power them. It may be over-engineered for current technology, but well suited for operations 10, 15 or 20 years down the track. The second argument is the battleship provides, quote, distinct enhancements to deterrence. Quote, while unseen platforms like submarines and space systems can give adversaries pause by creating uncertainty, ensuring peace through strength ultimately requires presence. The arrival of a battleship, whether in the port of an ally or on the horizon of an enemy, sends an unmistakable signal of American resolve matched today only by our aircraft carriers. End quote. Basically, while the battleship might be short on launch cells, it would be long on drip, an impressive way of showing the flag, and so one rocking up in an area might have deterrence value. Just like the arrival of Prince of Wales and Repulse in Singapore deterred the Japanese in the 1940s. So those are the arguments the document puts forward for the battleship. Let's talk about how many they're planning to build. The plan calls for the first battleship of the class to be procured, so ordered, not commissioned, in fiscal year 2028. The second in 2030, then 2031, and then on a fairly regular cadence of one every 2 years. The idea is for the first of the battleships to enter service with the Navy in 2036, the second in 2038, finally reaching a peak of 11 of these ships in service in 2055. What that suggests is that come the 2050s, the US Navy would be operating battleships and carriers on a roughly 1-to-1 ratio. And that comparison might feel all the more apt when we start to talk about cost. When we first talked about USS Defiant and compared it to some of the other ships out there, the chart here shows the very rough numbers were used, about $9 billion a hull. That was a very rough figure based on tonnage, which suggested Defiant should cost more than 3 Arleigh Burkes, but a little bit less than 2 Zumwalts. Based on that figure, you'll remember the conclusion being the ship was probably too expensive at that price point relative to the capability it seemed to provide to merit large-scale inclusion in the force. If you were constrained on dollars, there might be more efficient ways to get the capability you seem to want by comboing different platforms and equipment together. However, that analysis assumed a $9 billion price point. And thanks to the Shipbuilding Plan, the US Department of the Navy has helpfully clarified they don't actually expect Defiant to cost $9 billion. They expect it to cost closer to $17 billion, with $1 billion requested in fiscal year 27, then $16.97 billion in fiscal 28 for the first ship, with a total funding request out to 2031 of $43.5 billion with a B for 3 ships. That gives you an average per unit price of about $14.5 billion, making each of these battleships as or even more expensive than a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, almost 3 times their displacement. And one of the many reasons for that incredible dose of sticker shock might be is that despite the labelling on the chart there, this isn't apparently a BBG anymore. It's BBGN, because after repeatedly denying they were going to do so, apparently the Navy decided to take the battleship nuclear. Now this is interesting, because one of the last sections of my episode on the potential return of the battleship was a hypothetical. The basic question was, if you insisted on bringing back a battleship for modern Navy, what might you potentially do to make it useful? And one of the first things I suggested was that you use the size of the ship to fit a significant nuclear propulsion system. You do that because it would give you a lot more endurance, independence from logistics, and access to a lot more electrical generation capacity. Using that, you could essentially turn your hypothetical battleship into a high-energy platform, for lack of a better term. You could choose the most energy-intensive, over-the-top sensors, electronic warfare, and importantly, directed energy weapons, think lasers, and strap as many of them as you wanted to the platform. Because where a gas or diesel design might struggle, a reactor would manage. The original concept for Defiant and the Trump-class battleships, though, was that they be Kodak vessels, combined gas and diesel. That potentially would have made them very, very thirsty, but also potentially saved a couple of bucks on building the things. As recently as a couple of months ago, the then Secretary of the Navy said that discussions were ongoing about potentially making the warships nuclear-powered, but he said that was quote-unquote unlikely. That was notably puzzling to many, including a number of Russian commentators, given that in the past, when the Soviet Union faced a decision on how to build its own large, high-speed guided missile ships, the Kirov-class battlecruisers, it had also come to the conclusion that if you wanted to build a high-performance ship that large, you might as well stick a reactor in it, which they did. Now, leadership at the Navy Department has changed, and so too has the propulsion system for the battleship. It now seems the US is going to be getting its own Kirovs after all, with the U.S.N's Chief of Operations publicly saying that the US Navy's decision to totally abandon nuclear power for surface combatant other than carriers was, quote, one of the largest mistakes it's ever made. He highlighted some of the difficulties the Navy had faced fueling its conventionally powered ships taking part in operations against Iran. And through the discussions we found out that Defiant apparently won't just have a nuclear reactor, we also found out which one. Per the Admiral, quote, we're going to use an existing design. We're going to use the Ford reactor, the A1B reactor, and the components that support that from the vessel. The steam generator, pressurizer, loop components, reactor coolant pump components. So all of that technology is going into the design of the battleship, the nuclear battleship from the reactor plant perspective, end quote. Now, from a procurement and supply chain perspective, if you were going to make a nuclear-powered battleship as the United States, I'd argue this is pretty close to the top of the list of how you do it. It takes a long time to design and stand up the supply chain for a new nuclear reactor type. Each design has to have its own supply chain, its own maintenance regime, its own training regime to make sure you have people qualified on it. And given how fiendishly difficult it normally is to obtain scale in the nuclear reactor business, using an existing design makes sense. And thankfully for the potential battleship, the reactor is a divisible asset. The 100,000-ton displacement carrier is powered by 2 of them. So, hypothetically, you don't have to put the power plant designed for a 100,000-ton ship in the 35 to 40,000-tonner. You can chop the system down by half and be less ridiculously overbuilt. However, there is a difference between not being ridiculously overbuilt and not being overbuilt at all. You're still talking about putting 50,000 tons of displacement worth of power plant in a 35 to 40,000-ton vessel. And assuming the design and supporting systems can handle it, that leads to some pretty interesting implications for performance. It's generally a bit of an open secret that America's CVNs, and especially the Ford, are some of the fastest ships in the fleet. Officially, the Navy just says that the Nimitz and later Ford classes can do over 30 knots. How much more, they don't say. But there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that plus is doing a lot of heavy lifting. They can also hypothetically maintain higher speeds for longer periods because they don't have to worry about emptying their bunkers the way something like a destroyer might. Assuming the battleship comes in at the higher end of its displacement estimate, so 40,000 tons, not 35, on one A1B, you're looking at a roughly 25% increase in power-to-weight ratio compared to the already outrageously fast carrier. Make some rough assumptions around other potential limitations like beam and waterline, and you're inevitably going to come to the conclusion that unless there's some other aspect of the design holding it back, these BBGNs are going to be very, very fast ships. And as a side note, they may actually be in a better position to use that mobility strategically, operationally, and tactically than the carriers are. The carriers are restrained by the fact that most of the time they have to be glued to their battle group. A carrier with its destroyers is a tool for power projection. A carrier out by itself is a very expensive target waiting for an ambitious submarine captain, air or missile attack. But if the US Navy genuinely believes the new battleships would be capable of independent operations, then there might be cases where they aren't glued to conventionally powered escorts. In which case, as long as you don't mind the potential quality of life and maintenance implications, they could potentially relocate around the globe faster than any other ship in US or anyone else's inventory. The numbers are also fairly confronting if you try and estimate electrical power. As a baseline, the US Navy's Flight 3 Arleigh destroyers have gone through considerable upgrades and redesigns to get them to 12 megawatts of installed electrical power. By contrast, in the open source, the A1B reactors on the Ford are capable of providing so much electrical power that the US is planning exercises where Ford gets to play the role essentially of an offshore nuclear power plant for an emergency or disaster scenario. Practically speaking, you wouldn't really be energy constrained in terms of sensors, electronic warfare, and if in the future you successfully move from lasers in the hundreds of kilowatt range deep into the megawatts, trying to provide air and fleet defence, not just close-in ship defence or dazzling, this is a platform that could potentially run them and run them continuously. You'd also have a lot of hull volume for things like cooling and just general space for systems and equipment growth. I think a likely scenario is that a ship with this much installed electrical power wouldn't be able to effectively use it all now. The energy-hungry systems that could require it don't really currently exist. But from a future-proofing perspective, an A1B reactor would probably do it. There's also, as I said, more to like here from an industrial perspective about going with an existing design. The level of technical risk is reduced but not eliminated. You can use the existing training scheme and production line. Planning for maintenance, overhaul, modernisation and disposal is already in place. And so while, as the Admiral suggested, it's likely to be a long way from plug and play, this is far more credible as an approach if you want to move quickly than trying to start with a clean sheet design. One way to characterise this change then would be that when Defiant was first announced, an accusation was that it was a gold-plated design, that it was at once both hideously expensive but also didn't provide much in the way of unique capability, unless you're a massive railgun fanboy, to justify going with something new like this rather than cheaper existing concepts. The Navy's response to that criticism seems to have been to remove the gold plate from the design and replace it with platinum, meaning you now have an even more hideously expensive design, but at least it can do some unique things. If built as described, it would be a very strategically mobile ship. It would have a degree of logistical independence, more firepower on a ship-for-ship basis than any other large surface combatant out there. And if you believe that, if not the fleet of the 2020s or 2030s, but the 2040s or 2050s might be in the laser business in a big way, this thing would have a significant advantage over conventional destroyers and cruisers when it came to the possibility of mounting a destructive disco of lasers, microwaves, and everything in between. But, and there are a lot of buts, that capability gain in swapping out the propulsion system arguably makes many of these designs' other issues worse. There were already concerns about where you'd be able to build these things and if you could do it on schedule. Now you're limited to shipyards and workforce with nuclear capacity as well. It was already going to be an expensive design, and adding a nuclear reactor is probably unlikely to make it cheaper. The core point is that if this thing was actually built as advertised, then as the document seems to suggest, it probably would be quite a capable ship. It would bring a lot of performance, some nice-to-have features, and a lot of bells and whistles to the Navy's high-low mix, and I doubt a combatant commander that was told, hey, you're getting one of these things in your AO, would ever be disappointed having one available as compared to an Arleigh destroyer. The challenge, though, is that when you're designing a fleet, resources are limited and everything is relative. And when you hypothetically have strategic competitors capable of turning out ships with fewer bells and whistles but almost equivalent missile firepower for a tenth of the price, there might be some pretty big questions to answer as to whether betting it all on the battleship is actually the best use of the available budget. Moving on from one of the big items that has changed compared to previous shipbuilding plans, I want to quickly talk about some of the things that haven't. Places where investment plans seem mostly consistent, with all the implications that has for future US naval power. The Ford-class carriers, for example, are being examined for potential improvements, but for the moment, the plan is apparently to keep churning them out. We found out that over the course of its most recent deployment, which kicked off in June 2025, Ford executed something like 10,500 fixed-wing launch and recoveries, with the report describing the class as now being a, quote, battle-proven design, end quote. As we flagged in the force growth figures, there's also a lot of bubblehead in the budget as well, with the US due to spend more on nuclear submarines than it is on carriers, battleships, destroyers and frigates combined. Over the course of the 5 years, the US would order 10 Virginia-class attack submarines, with the per-unit cost dropping from about $7 billion in fiscal year 2027 to about $5.6 billion in fiscal 2031, for an average of about $6.3 billion per unit over the 5 years. And as for the Columbia-class boomers, they appear to have kept their place at the top of the priority list. The idea seems to be to order one of these next-generation ballistic missile submarines per year, for an average cost of about $12.4 billion per unit. That might seem ridiculously high, but it's in the same ballpark as the other next-generation boomers we know about in equivalent markets. The UK's Dreadnought, for example, or France's new SSBN, are both believed to be in roughly that category. One thing I'd suggest, though, reading between the lines of this plan, is the interesting element isn't what's meant to happen in the next 5 years. It's a subtle clue contained in the plan for the next 30. This isn't new, it was also present in previous versions of the Shipbuilding Plan, but it's interesting enough that I think it's worth flagging here. The US actually currently operates 3 main types of nuclear submarine. There are the nuclear attack boats, so Los Angeles, Seawolf and Virginia class. Then there are the existing ballistic missile submarines, Ohios until they're replaced with the Columbias. Then there's an interesting middle category, the SSGN. These are a small number of converted Ohio ballistic missile submarines that, after the end of the Cold War at great expense, had the US go in and basically rip out the old Trident launchers and replace them with approximately all of the Tomahawks. A single Ohio SSGN can carry a small fleet's worth of cruise missiles, 154 in total. And as the plan notes, they've contributed to US plans time and time again. Not only theoretically, because any opponent has to assume that at any given time the US could have 300 Tomahawks parked practically anywhere off their coastline, but also in actual kinetic operations. Quote, just one Navy SSGN launched dozens of Tomahawk land attack missiles aiding the destruction of key Iranian nuclear weapons facilities. End quote. So these things are arguably useful, but they're also old and due for retirement. This plan has the remaining boats retiring one at a time in fiscal years 27, 28 and 29, meaning that throughout the 2030s, the United States Navy would have 0 of these Tomahawk slingers. However, apparently that state of affairs isn't meant to last forever, because starting in fiscal year 2038, this plan has the United States Navy ordering guided missile submarines again, procuring them at a rate of 1 every 3 years out to the end of the plan in 2056. Now, this document says absolutely nothing about what kind of submarine those SSGNs would be. Technically speaking, there's nothing to say they couldn't be a Virginia, for example, stretched out with a super payload module, or maybe an SSNX modified for the role. But as you can see demonstrated through my artistic highlighting skills on the right there, there's a coincidence of timing here that might give rise to one additional theory. The US is meant to procure the final ship of the Columbia class in 2035. At that point, the question might be, what happens to the Columbia line from there? Obviously, it would be busy for a few years working through that back order of boats, but what then? Well, hypothetically, if you were to start ordering new boats again 2 or 3 years later and then continue ordering them at a regular cadence, potentially you could keep the yard and the workforce going. And our mystery SSGN, would you believe it, starts getting ordered 2 to 3 years after the last Columbia. You're likely looking at a large payload submarine that, given the potential hull size, could probably accommodate just about any missile you care to fit to it. On the attack boat side, the generational changeover isn't apparently meant to happen until the mid-2040s. That's when SSNX is meant to start entering the fleet, and until then, it's Virginia. The order cadence here is pretty simple, 2 Virginias a year, making it, on average, the most expensive line item in the entire shipbuilding plan. $62.9 billion over 5 years, beating the $62 billion flat for the Columbia, and the combined 55 and change for the carriers and battleships. That tells you a lot about the US Navy continuing to prioritise the nuclear submarine force, but precious little, as I said, about the next generation. We're told they're meant to start entering the fleet in the 2040s, that they're meant to operate alongside the Virginias, and they're meant to be able to, quote, penetrate and dominate heavily defended adversary areas, with a larger payload volume, superior survivability, and organic housing of unmanned robotic and autonomous systems. Of those features, most seem to me like the standard incremental improvements you'd expect from class to class, with the confirmation the submarine is being designed from the ground up with hosting robotic and autonomous systems in mind being perhaps the standout exception. We know that a nuclear submarine force is expensive, and that it's always going to suffer a mass problem relative to, say, a conventional submarine force because of that. Turning each nuclear boat into a hub, a control system and carrier for more numerous, cheaper underwater uncrewed systems is a potential response to that. And so SSNX is starting to sound passingly for the Navy submarine force the way some concepts of NGAD were meant to be for the US Air Force. An extremely survivable, extremely expensive, high-end frontline combatant that could serve as a penetrating control node for a team of unmanned systems. Questions about the long-term survivability of submarines aside, If there is an asterisk or unknown here, it probably isn't the quality of the underlying designs, but instead the capacity of the US submarine industrial base to actually deliver them. 2 attack boats per annum is something the US has been talking about for years. Delays aren't so much the exception as they are the norm. And so while this is a very impressive fleet submarine plan on paper, the real question, I think, is whether the funding and industrial capacity is going to be there to turn statements into subs. Okay, so we've talked about some of the big stuff, the unchanging stuff. Now, let's pivot to the small surface combatant side, America's favourite, the frigates. I think it's fair to say that the US Navy's search for a surface combatant smaller than the Arleigh Burke has become a bit of a meme at this point. It's long been assessed, and still being assessed by leaders in the Navy, that there are plenty of jobs from submarine hunting to convoy escort, where a comparatively loud, multi-billion-dollar, full-size destroyer with weapons that can reach out into space probably isn't the best fit. This is absolutely not a new phenomenon. As the US Navy's surface warfare director recently put it, quote, "In 1995, I did counter-drug ops in my first ship, the USS Philippine Sea," end quote. For those of you who don't know, Philippine Sea is a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser. He went on to say, quote, "Nowadays, a guided missile destroyer for counter-narcotics ops is a choice I don't want the fleet commander to have to go through," end quote. For a lot of these missions that don't need a full-sized air defence destroyer, most navies out there have a class of ship, the frigate, and in the past, the US Navy did as well. In the late Cold War era, the Navy had the Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates, which generally worked as frigates. But after they retired, the next thing in the broadly frigate-sized category was the LCS, which didn't really work. I won't reopen the entire can of worms of LCS again here, but suffice to say, some of the criticisms were that it was inadequately survivable, not properly armed, and relied on a concept of modular mission payloads that in the end didn't work as originally advertised. The LCS build was truncated, and in its place, we got FFGX, the Constellation class. Constellation addressed many of the criticisms that had been directed against LCS. As well as the usual missile box launchers, guns, and defensive systems, it had a 32-cell VLS. It was equipped with high-end sensors and the Aegis combat system, making it a viable air defence combatant, and given its combination of propulsion and sensor systems, it would have been a valid anti-submarine warfare combatant as well. Some of the objections to Constellation, though, were that as all these capabilities were added and the design was revised, it became too expensive and too capable for the lower-end surface combatant it was meant to be. The Congressional Budget Office estimated the ships would end up costing about $1.4 billion each. And so with the exception of 2 ships that were already in construction, which will be completed and delivered, as we covered in a previous episode, the rest of the Constellation class got canned. In its place was this thing, much less a pocket air warfare destroyer in an anti-submarine warfare frigate package, and instead more a converted Coast Guard Legend-class cutter adapted for naval use. FFX, so ditching the G to indicate a guided missile ship, is still, based on the data we've seen so far, meant to carry some guided missiles, up to 16 naval strike missiles in BOC launchers, or a 48-cell Hellfire system for shooting down drones, but the NSMs were also present on the Constellation anyway, and what is missing is the VLS. Also missing are some of the higher-end sensors, and of course the Aegis combat system. Oh, and the sonar. Doesn't have that either. No built-in bow or towed array, so if you want the ship itself to be able to do that, you're going to either need to modify the ship or use your containerised payload to do so. FFX then is clearly not meant to be a frontline frigate in the same way as those operated by some other navies. The People's Liberation Army Navy put a 32-cell VLS on their frontline frigate, the Type 54. The British Type 26 has a VLS, the Japanese Mogami has a VLS, FREM, FDI, a lot of those European frigate designs have a VLS, and of course Russian designs tend to be very heavily missile equipped as well. The basic idea here then seems to have been to very deliberately downscale the design, more down to the low end of what a small surface combatant can potentially do, and instead go with something the plan describes as, quote, highly producible, cost-effective, and adaptive, end quote. There's a couple of places, though, where the data in the plan seems to conflict with that characterisation. For one, while FFX is basically described as the rapidly producible, faster-market option, the plan still expects Constellation to make it into the force first. The first Constellation is meant to enter service in fiscal year 2029, the second in FY 2030, the same year the first FFX arrives in the force. At that point, a second FFX isn't expected until 2033, with no more frigates following until 2036, at which point there is a surge in deliveries, and then you fall into a cadence of 3 per year. Presumably in part thanks to the later kickoff, the procurement schedule is also slower to ramp up as well. The FY25 plan envisioned ordering 3 Constellations a year starting in FY 2031. This plan doesn't have the simpler, faster-to-deliver ship getting to that level until 2032. While it's obviously possible Constellation would have been further and further delayed, it's worth noting that on paper, this rapidly producible and deliverable ship isn't exactly next-day delivery. But okay, Perun, you might ask, at least by going over to the simpler, more affordable design, the Navy will then save a bunch of money that it can spend on other things, like, battleships. And it's true, FFX has been repeatedly described by various figures as an affordable or cost-effective option. Although based on past precedent, there might be reason to suggest those words don't have the same meaning in the halls of power of Washington, D.C. than they do in many other places. That said, how affordable and cost-effective are we talking here? At one point, the Navy said it thought it could do the Constellation class for about $1 billion a hull. The CBO said that number would likely creep up to about 1.4, 1.5 from memory. And since that was obviously way too high for a frontline, fully tricked-out frigate, this new shipbuilding plan aims to procure 4 of these newer, cheaper frigates over the course of the next 5 years for a grand total of just over $7 billion or about $1.75 billion per. As you can see on the right, it's more than $1.4 billion in fiscal year 27, $300 million in fiscal year 2028, $1.65 billion in fiscal 29, and a peak of $2.76 billion in fiscal year 2031. Meaning, on paper, you are potentially looking at a small surface combatant that can't really do surface combat, a cheap ship that's actually expensive, and a fast-to-deliver option that actually arrives later than the slow-to-deliver one it replaced. Now, obviously, there's more to the story here, and it's not all that cut and dry. But I still think it's stark enough that the numbers on that page might prompt some people to ask a question. America, why do you do this to yourselves? How is it that when it comes to things like aircraft carriers, you can build the kind of constructions that other countries would deeply struggle with? But as soon as you try and slap a frigate label on the side of a ship, everything melts down. If you hand the South Koreans $1.5, $1.6, $1.7 billion a ship, they won't build you a frigate, they'll build you an Aegis-equipped super destroyer with the missile firepower of a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, or if you ask for it, a battleship. So many American allied countries have come up with modern frigate designs that have VLS and a lot of these combat features and yet cost considerably less. FREM has VLS, Megami has VLS. The British Type 26 is in the same rough cost category as you're talking about for the new FFX here, and it has a bunch of bells and whistles, a 24-cell Mark 41, and a separate VLS to support its air defence needs. It was actually designed with the anti-submarine warfare role in mind, not as a converted Coast Guard cutter, and if the US went with something like it, there'd be some industrial commonality with a bunch of allies, the UK, Canada and Australia included. Or alternatively, if you don't want something higher capability at the same price point, you could go for the cheaper frigate option and actually have it cheap. I genuinely understand some of the defenders of the FFX concept who say that we don't need a high-capability pocket Burt for a lot of the jobs the Navy has to do. If you're doing a lot of flag flying and counter-narcotics, sure, you can probably get away with building something that doesn't have the full traditional Aegis air defence package or the sensors and systems necessary to hunt the Red October across the Atlantic. But if you're going to deliberately try and build something at the low end of the high-low mix, it has to actually be cheap. And while there could be some stuff going on here with things like long lead items, just looking at this, FFX isn't that. The UK and European Union are notoriously not the cheapest shipbuilding environments, but they've been able to come up with genuinely cheaper general-purpose frigate designs, Type 31 out of the United Kingdom or FDI out of France as examples. So if there's any desire to copy someone else's homework, there are plenty of answers already out there. There are even legitimately military scenarios where you can argue you would be better off with a Russian Gorshkov-class frigate than you would with FFX, because this is what you should expect from the front view of a Russian frigate. Yes, you might be able to strap some containerized VLS to the back of an FFX, but that's not the same as an integrated VLS, and it's arguably not directly equivalent to a Russian ship that might be flinging Cytocon hypersonics in return. Now, we've talked about the Constellation class. There were very real criticisms, very real issues, and between the Navy, Congress, and everyone else involved, there are probably not many out there that would argue this was a good case of program management. But at least it was unambiguously a combat frigate, ASW and air defence capable, and a match in a potential fight for a lot of the competitor designs out there. FFX, while clearly still expensive, is not intended to operate at that level. And while yes, as stated in the plan, the idea is to give it some missile firepower by adding containerized VLS, the Navy's documents already make clear there's some intention to study further iterations of the design, including, would you believe it, quote, studies for future flights that will consider expanded capabilities, including vertical launch systems and anti-submarine warfare systems, end quote. So, yeah, we might see a switch away from Constellation to FFX in order to save money by chopping features, not actually saving money in the process, and then adding some of those features back onto FFX. In short, while things could always be turned around, there's no sign yet of the US Navy throwing off its long-term frigate curse. FFX doesn't appear intended to save the Navy a huge amount of money, at least over the short term we have detailed estimates for, while at the same time, it'll presumably poleaxe the total fleet's VLS count. Because remember how the document said earlier that fires were so critical to winning wars? Well, a lot of the US Navy's future missile firepower was meant to be on those Constellation frigates. And by swapping them out to FFX, you get this chart here. Compared to the cheaper fiscal year 25 plan, introducing 15 guided missile battleships adds about 1,900 standard VLS cells to the fleet. There's also 6 additional destroyers, and if we ignore the change in type of those destroyers, and instead generously assume that in both plans they were all Arleigh Burkes, they weren't, but more on that later, that's roughly another 580 cells for the FY27 plan. But removing all the VLS from the frigate force loses you about 2,600, which actually puts you negative, unless you account for either containerized VLS being added to FFX, or you start counting the conventional prompt strike hypersonics on the battleships. In reality, that probably means the FY2027 fleet is going to have more missile cells on net. Just. But given how much additional money is meant to be spent, some people might be surprised to see it close at all. Which brings us to our final section. We've done the big, the small, and the unchanging. What about the missing? Stuff you might have expected a couple of years ago to be in the 2026 plan, but isn't. Now, right up front, one thing that isn't missing is the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The plan calls for continuing to procure guided missile destroyers. The Arleigh Burke is specifically named in the plan at a rate of 1 per year in 27, 28, and 29, and then 2 every year out to the end of the plan. What isn't there that you might have previously expected is a replacement for the Burke. In the fiscal 25 plan, destroyer procurement was chopped into 2 parts. The next 23 ships would be Arleigh Burkes, and the 28 destroyers after that a next-generation ship, DDGX. This is a concept that had been in the works for years and incorporated many of the features we discussed earlier in relation to the battleship. More power generation, directed energy weapons, hypersonic missiles, you name it. Now, we were told late last year that DDX was likely being canned. As the announcement on the right there put it, quote, the new Trump-class battleships will replace the Navy's previous plan to develop a new class of destroyer, the DDGX, end quote. But a number of commentators still held out expectations or hope that that wasn't the case, with one of the main arguments being that a destroyer and a guided missile battleship serve different purposes. That's actually something this shipbuilding plan explicitly calls out, saying the battleship is meant to serve as a, quote, robust, survivable forward command and control platform. It is not a destroyer replacement, end quote. So unless the argument was you wouldn't need destroyers in the future or the Burke would be fine forever, it would arguably be kind of odd to replace your destroyer program with a ship you specifically say is not a destroyer replacement. And yet, in this shipbuilding plan, DDGX is nowhere to be seen. It's not mentioned in the ship designs, even though other future concepts like the next-gen attack sub are. It's not in the budget, it's not in the build list, it's nowhere. If that's so, it has a lot of implications for the potential future firepower and capability of the US Navy's destroyer force that aren't entirely captured in that missile chart I showed you earlier. DDGX wasn't just meant to be more survivable, longer endurance, with better sensors, more power generation, more future-proofed, etc. It was also meant to be capable of carrying the same large hypersonic missiles that are going onto Zumwalts and are apparently intended for the battleships. Only because there were meant to be more of them in the fleet, removing them and replacing the program with the battleship might actually result in there being considerably fewer hypersonic cells in the future force than there otherwise would be. It also potentially raises a massive question over the long-term future of the US destroyer force. The Arleigh Burke is a great ship, but it is still a 1980s design and arguably close to maxed out on upgrade potential. Other nations out there, US allies and competitors alike, have come out with new modern destroyer concepts or designs. So the question probably is, if you're cancelling the next-gen destroyer project, what are you building instead? Is the plan genuinely to keep building Arleigh Burkes into the 2050s? Because at that point, the design would be close to 70 years old, and there is a genuine possibility that other countries that aren't constrained by the need to keep retrofitting an old design are able to jump ahead in terms of the capability and efficiency of their ships. Some voices in the US Navy might say they want a battleship, but they clearly need destroyers. And so not having DDX or an equivalent in a plan like this is arguably a bit of a deafening absence. A final note here is on unmanned systems, and a lot of the strategy and thinking here is actually in an appendix. Overall, the plan highlights some expenditure on unmanned systems over the next 5 years, but all of it pales in comparison to things like the battleship. There's $1.1 billion over 5 years to purchase 16 uncrewed XL UUVs. Think the Orca on the right there. They can potentially do a bunch of things, like, sail out into interesting, highly contested areas of water that an adversary might want to cross as part of an amphibious operation and lay a bunch of mines there. While described as part of a, quote, core element of naval combat power, end quote, the total investment on the entire fleet of these things over the next half-decade is less than that being spent on a single FFX frigate. There's also $3.1 billion over 5 years to purchase 47 MUSVs, so medium unmanned surface vessels, which are still very much in that development prototype phase, but are likely to look something like what you see on the right there. A relatively simple robotic vessel that you can put a containerized payload on. What isn't present is something we've seen other navies like the Germans start to gravitate towards, which is uncrewed systems specifically designed to boost the overall firepower of the fleet. In the German case, that would be the Large Remote Missile Vessel, which is basically what happens when you take a small robotic ship and stick a bunch of missiles on the back of it. You then sail it around with a manned frigate that provides the sensors, the command and control, etc., and the small ship serves as a kind of uncrewed magazine extender. That concept obviously has drawbacks, but if you're trying to add massed firepower and magazine depth, it's probably much cheaper to do something like this than it is to build a 35,000-ton ship and then put a cruiser's worth of missiles on it. In other words, while there is some investment in uncrewed systems, this isn't an uncrewed-centric budget. This is not a revolution in naval shipbuilding so much as an incremental step in it. And I think the question still deserves to be asked whether, in light of recent experience with the Ukrainians and Iranians, this budgetary division of effort really accurately reflects all the modern lessons learned. Now, if we had an unlimited amount of time, there's plenty more I could potentially go through here. There's a lot in the plan about shipbuilding reform, for example, which I'll talk about in a future episode, and there are questions to be asked about things like projected sustainment costs. But in the interest of time, let's keep the closeout discussion focused on the combat ships themselves. Compared to previous years, this is a record-breaking shipbuilding budget, but it's also, on paper, a budget being eaten by the battleships. Over the next 5 years, they're meant to absorb more funding than the destroyers and frigates combined, and almost twice what's been allocated for the carriers. Expressed another way, if you kept the same amount of funding but you cut the battleships from the budget, you could potentially fund 7 additional Arleigh Burkes, add an extra carrier, and still have enough money left over to buy the entire Ukrainian naval drone force, or enough missiles and torpedoes to sink a reasonably sized navy, and still probably have cash left over. Budgeting is generally the art of the trade-off, and in this case the battleship is the trade, and a lot of other things get the off. Of course, I'd suggest if we're being realistic, there's a decent chance that most of this never happens. It seems highly likely that a future US administration might put the kibosh on the battleship, and even now, Congress, which controls the purse strings, appears to be deeply sceptical. A recent move, for example, would potentially reportedly block the progress of the battleship program until it was clear that all of its weapon systems had reached a sufficient level of technical readiness, which, given the thing is meant to pack everything from railguns to hypersonic missiles to directed energy weapons, could, in practical terms, basically be the same as saying no. And from a long-term US naval planning perspective, that opens up a couple of uncomfortable options. Version 1, the US administration changes over at the end of 2028, none of these battleships are actually built, the program is cancelled, and the focus is moved back to things like next-generation destroyers. In that case, what you're talking about here is billions of dollars and, critically, years of time potentially being wasted. You've put DDGX on hold, you might have shuffled the people involved in it around, and in the interim, you spend a bunch of money developing something that you end up not building, or perhaps build just 1 or 2 examples of. In that world, the Defiants become the next Zumwalts or Constellations, a handful of artisanally produced ships in a standalone class. In an alternative hypothetical, let's assume for a moment the ships actually do get built. The risk in that case, instead, is that you end up with a very cost-inefficient US fleet. It's hard to imagine in many of the major US wargaming scenarios, an Asia-Pacific escalation or a kickoff in the Middle East, a world where you wouldn't be better off replacing a $17 billion battleship with an equal dollar value in some other investment. Carriers, drones, missiles, submarines, satellites, you name it. And if you accept the US is entering a world where its primary strategic competitor has a lot of industrial heft and budgetary resources, efficiency is arguably going to be much more critical from the US perspective than it might have been in the 1990s or early 2000s. It's notable that no other global fleet is really going in this direction. The Russians have actually attracted a lot of flack internationally for pouring ruble after ruble into trying to keep their expensive nuclear-powered surface combatant in service. The Admiral Nakimov absorbed a lot of modernization and maintenance funding, arguably at the expense of a lot of other things Russia probably needed more. Although even there you could make the observation that, ton for ton, the Kirovs both displaced less than the proposed Defiant, while also packing, by Western standards, a very, very heavy missile armament. I'm very happy to acknowledge that I always come at these things from a very specific defence economic standpoint. But there's a final set of comments I want to reflect on the end here that kind of go to the nature of this entire shipbuilding plan. A lot of the US Navy figures we've seen speak in favour of these battleships have spoken to the capabilities of the individual vessel. One reportedly described the ship as quote-unquote badass. Others noted that with the DDGX program, the Navy was facing having to make, quote, undesirable capability and weapon system compromises, end quote, in order to make the design work. As the Director of Surface Warfare put it, quote, in order to keep an adequate number of Mark 41 cells on DDGX, we were going to have to make a choice between a gun weapon system and conventional prompt strike. I don't want to put those kind of limits on the fleet, end quote. But here's the thing. You can't escape trade-offs. Not entirely. You can just move them to another part of the problem. And to a great extent, I'd argue effective trade-offs are part of what a good requirements process is made of. The foresight to know what you want now and are likely to want in the future, the ruthlessness to then separate want from need, and the discipline to avoid getting sidetracked along the way. Sure, DDGX would have had to make trade-offs, the same way the Chinese Type 55 does. But presumably if those trade-offs had allowed it to stay in the destroyer/cruiser size and cost category, you could have built more of them. You could have established industrial scale. You could have diverted resources to other aspects of the fleet. If you fail to make trade-offs on what you want an individual platform to be able to do, well, that's how you potentially end up with a $17 billion surface combatant. And the limit for the fleet doesn't become what the individual ship can do, it becomes a limit of what the force can do because you've had to defund a bunch of other things in order to build the super ship. It's still probably the case that the most likely future for BBGN is eventual cancellation or serious revision. But given the resources available, if the focus and time was dedicated to it by successive administrations, the US could probably build the thing. You probably could bring back the modern battleship, and it almost certainly would be the most dangerous, most capable surface combatant afloat. Fast, strategically mobile, heavily armed, well defended, and seriously future-proofed for energy-intensive systems. What this budget shows, though, is what a superweapon can cost the rest of the force. Given the enormous size of the US military budget, a double-digit percentage boost to shipbuilding could do a lot of things. It could dramatically refill magazines, refresh just about every aspect of the force, continue with destroyer modernisation. It could build a significant number of well-armed, high-end ASW-capable frigates, and adopt a whole bunch of unmanned systems to reflect the nature of modern warfare. Oh, and don't forget funding is still up in the air for some vital aspects of US naval air power, the element that's done so much heavy lifting in so many US campaigns. Think things like the FAXX 6th generation fighter, or various unmanned systems the Navy wants as well. Or it could give the United States Navy its own fleet of 21st century Kirovs, the Admiral's badass battleships. What it can't do, by these numbers, is both. And okay, brief channel update to close out. Firstly, I hope you enjoyed this brief pivot back to the United States, but barring any dramatic events in the next couple of days, I do want to get back to Ukraine relatively soon, because having recently covered the battlefield and long-range strike campaign, I think there is an element in the middle that bears talking about. In terms of planning for the channel itself, I'm now in the process of long-term planning for travel in the second part of the year, with the idea being that as much material as possible is prepared in advance to try and avoid potential disruptions. Finally, on the Peruvian gaming side, the Xenonauts 2 series should be finishing off soon, so expect some announcements there on what's going to come next, including the long-awaited closeout to the ICBM series. That's all for the moment, so I hope you enjoyed, and with any luck, I'll see you all again next week.